And welcome back to Voices of Santa Barbara. I'm your host today, Mark McIntyre. Good to be with you, and hope you all had a very happy Thanksgiving. Well, you know, we're dodging rainstorms here in Santa Barbara and on the Central Coast. We get another one moving in tonight through the weekend, so be very careful out there when you're driving, especially if you live up on the 154. I would avoid it myself, but that's up to you. In any case, what we have today is the fourth appearance here on KZSB AM 1290, your news talk radio on the Central Coast. We have the Professor Emeritus, okay, I'm going to get this straight, Professor Emeritus at Santa Barbara City College from the Philosophy Department. He was chairman for so many years now, Joe? 30 years?
30 years.
30 years. Chairman for 30 years. And during that particular time, his record has been spotless, absolutely spotless. He never put a wrong foot or a wrong punctuation mark. The only mistake he did make was 25 years ago, he hired me to teach logic. So, yeah, I know.
That's the only one.
I know, me teaching logic, right? What could go wrong with that, right? What could possibly go wrong, right? In any case, Joe survived. He survived, although many people thought that he was completely crazy, including me, for doing this. We have had a great working relationship for the last 25 years, and I want to publicly thank Joe for giving me 23 years of work at Santa Barbara City College, which I really have enjoyed. In any case, we're here to talk about Joe and a special project that he has recently received an award from the United Nations Central Coast
Association.
UNA. UNA. And it's a fascinating story. And so I'm just going to let Professor White take over at this particular point, because the great thing about having Joe on as a guest is you just introduce him and then you sit back and drink your tea. Okay. Hi, Joe.
Hello, Mark. And thanks for having me here. And I think when you mentioned being here 4 times, I don't know if that covers the talk about ignorance and stupidity and all of those as well.
All of those things, yeah.
Well, anyway, with the Year Without War, I was quite honored and very surprised that in the field of nominees that there were 7 of us altogether, that A Year Without War was selected. The other 6 nominees all do very impressive on-the-ground work. I think about half of them were in Africa. And one program deals with trauma, and they've dealt with some of these mass killings in the United States. So the other nominees were, in my estimation, most worthy. And so when it was announced that
it was across the street, wasn't it?
Yes, at the University Club.
Okay, right.
And when it was announced that A Year Without War was selected, and I received the Peace Prize.
And you didn't know before the award ceremony?
No.
You didn't? Oh,
no. Wow. I was in the Midwest visiting with family, and I came back early because I was told that, there's always a chance you could win.
You're a nominee.
and I knew who the other nominees were. I said, no, there's not a chance I'm going to win. Well, you really need to be here.
Yeah. So what were the parameters for the award? Why was the award given to you?
That's a really good question. I've not heard what the formal criteria were, but I was told that the panel of judges used the same criteria that is used for selecting a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a pretty high bar.
Well, I think, I think it probably has to do with, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I should ask. I know one of the judges in particular, and I just haven't had that conversation with her. But I think part of it has to do with the sort of global reach of your program. And with the other nominees, they're doing really important things that are urgent and must be done. I mean, issues of water, issues of education, and that, which means having a school, having desks, having all those specific things. Where A Year Without War, its focus is in some sense trying to bend the arc of history. And my sense was, in talking to people afterwards at the reception afterwards, was that played a role, that this is a program that if it succeeds, all of these other programs succeed. And if this program of A Year Without War doesn't succeed, then everybody else will carry on and have to do all this cleanup that goes on with the state that the world is in right now.
And it's the most incredible thing for our viewers, our listeners who have not been keeping track of what's been going on with Professor White and the organization of A Year Without War. It's a rather incredible idea. It's a big idea. It's a gigantic idea. And that is that he's been campaigning and lobbying and urging for 1 year, where the world's nations do not engage in war. Am I correct?
You're correct. And actually, if we drill down a bit here for a moment, what we've discovered and where we are right now is that the United Nations, for every Olympic year, every 2 years, winter, summer, pass now, as of I think it's 2005, 2007, a 2-month global Olympic truce. Mm-hmm. And the recent one for this Winter Olympics in South Korea had the effect of bringing the North and the South together for the first time since the 50s. Mm-hmm. And these truces have had this subtle subtle effect in the world where small skirmishes are actually brought to a stop. Mm-hmm. But part of our problem at the outset was not appreciating what happens when these sorts of processes occur at a global level. Mm-hmm. And it really struck us, a group of students that I ended up going with to Bogota, Colombia, when we were invited to the Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates, that I realized there are literally millions and millions of people operating at this global level, pushing in this direction. Mm-hmm. So what our program is now solely focused on, and maybe one of my prime problems may be solved today in this radio program, given the outreach that your program has globally.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. We even have Outer Mongolia. We are actually.
I would love to have Mongolia be the sponsor.
We do. We had some students on the show a year ago, and they were from Outer Mongolia. So we primed them to have them listen. So they did. We actually could say that we had people listening in Outer Mongolia.
Well, here's the question.
Yeah.
Here's where we are right now, and here's the question.
Yeah, tell us where you are now.
If anybody out there in that world has a country that is a member of the United Nations that would be willing to step up and start the process in the United Nations to extend the anticipated 2024 Paris Summer Olympic truce by 10 months. That's what we're trying to find.
All right, now let's go over that again, because that's a lot of stuff right there. Okay.
All right. In 2024, there will be a Summer Olympics.
Right.
If the past 20 years are any indication, there will be a 2-month global truce passed by the United Nations for the 2024 Paris Summer Olympics. We would simply like to have that 2-month truce extended by 10 months to give humanity their first 1-year global truce. If we can start that process in 2020, then our community, which you've helped build, our community will go into hyper growth.
And what you need is one member country at the United Nations level to introduce the resolution. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. And at this point, rather than having that one member nation introduce it, we would like to start to build a consortium before we take it into the formal process.
Right.
Because since France is hosting the Summer Olympics, we would like them to take the lead on this. And from what I understand, their model for the Olympics is creativity and surprise.
Well, I'm sure President Macron would really appreciate some favorable press by sponsoring this at the United Nations. And since the Summer Olympics are happening in his country, it seems to me that you've even gone to the Vatican.
I've gone.
I remember that you went to the Vatican with a couple of students, and very favorably received. This is a no-brainer. For anybody who is opposed to further conflict through war, a resolution of conflict.
Well, and we're trying to keep it very simple. We're not a peace organization. We're not pacifists. We're not anti-military. Let's just get a 1-year truce and see what happens.
See, that's you and I were talking about when you actually began. We're coming up on our first break, so I'm gonna gingerly segue out of this, and then we'll come back. When you began, you didn't immediately go to the United Nations. You took the long road.
The long way round.
And I think that you've been doing this for 5 years now, 6 years?
9.
No, oh my gosh, 9.
You were such a child.
Yeah, I know. I only joined you about 5 years ago, I think. Got involved in it. Anyway, yeah, after we come back from the break with Professor Joseph White, by the way, if you don't know him personally, you do know somebody who had him in class for 30 years at Santa Barbara City College teaching philosophy. So we're going to take our first break here if our timing is correct. And we are KZSB AM 1290 News Talk Radio here in Santa Barbara. All right, we're right back here with Professor Joseph White, actually Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Santa Barbara City College. A gentleman that I've come to know for 25 years. We don't always agree on things, but we certainly agree on the one thing, and that is that we should stop fighting wars. Nations should just stop that. It's getting to a point where we're not talking about sticks and stones and sabers and muskets or even automatic rifles. We're talking about global catastrophe, and we need to get on with developing humanity. We need to get on with developing a kinder, better world, and that's what Joe has been working at. But before the break, we were discussing about the fact that right now, as you explained in the first segment, right now you're targeting one country that is a member nation of the United Nations. Could be the General Assembly. It doesn't have to be the Executive Council. It could be the
Security Council.
Security Council.
No, it doesn't have to be them. It just we need to build this consortium.
Gotcha.
And the real momentum is that if we once we get our first country committed to this expansion. It appears as though we will have the gravitas at that point to really start the hyper building. Because there are two phases. The first phase is getting the truce, but the second phase is building the community, which now we have technology available, which previously hasn't been available.
Right.
And many of your listeners may already know this, but in 1928, the 63 most powerful nations or established nations of the world came together and began the process of signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact, also known as the Paris Peace Pact, which simply outlawed war. They're just two simple articles, just no more war. I mean, we saw what happened with our first industrial war in World War I, and we can't resolve the inevitable conflicts. I mean, the diversity amongst Homo sapiens is so great that we've got to find another method because our weapons are becoming so deadly at this point.
I think part of your job, part of the difficulty in your job is responding to critics and skeptics. And I'd like to drill down into that a little bit because I know that you've been working at that for 9 years, 5 years that I've known that been working with you. How do you answer these skeptics who say that war is ingrained in the human DNA, that we're not the only animals that make war? Chimpanzees make war. Ants even make war.
Bonobos don't.
Well, exactly. So how do you answer people who say, well, this is a nice idea, Joe, and thank you very much for doing it, but in reality, you're not going to convince Vladimir Putin to stop, you're not going to convince a lot of people in the Middle East to put their weapons away. You're not going to convince these people of doing that. It's how do you respond to that ingrained skepticism that seems to come up every time that somebody thinks about a year without war?
Well, a year without war is just an idea that they're reacting to. If you go back and read the literature of the 1850s regarding slavery, you hear pseudoscience, you hear historical arguments. There are all sorts of quotes from the Old Testament. Slavery is just part of civilization. Everybody practices it. It's here. Some people are inferior. This is the way it is. You're not going to get rid of this.
Yeah.
And that same thing comes up with women's enfranchisement. All these kinds of arguments, disenfranchising, are reluctant to change. They've pulled back on things like human nature, whatever that is. A year without war is an experiment. I don't know if it's going to succeed. I don't know what it is. I mean, history's unfolding. And if anything, I think we've learned from the 20th century, especially from the world of philosophy, is that there's much more contingency in the world than there was in the Middle Ages. You know, they had their wonderful little necessary syllogisms with all these wonderful inferences. It's just more complicated these days. And the sense of uncertainty that we live with, but also now the sense that things are not going well in a big way. I mean, even for a superpower like the United States with just our infrastructure, you know, we have all these issues of health care. You know, the last thing that we should be focused on now is spending up, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars thinking about how we're going to kill each other. And when you look at the world budget, it's estimated to be around $2 trillion a year in military spending. So let's just try an experiment. Let's see if we could stop dueling. Let's see if we could eliminate slavery. Let's see if everybody gets a vote. I mean, we're not there yet. And you read grand documents like the Declaration of Independence, or you listen to a speech like the Gettysburg Address, and we're not there. And, you know, it's been a couple hundred years since the Declaration of Independence. It's been over 100 years since the Gettysburg Address. We're not there yet. But you need a vision that says the amount of blood and treasure that humanity is spending to kill each other when, you know, are we on the verge of the next pandemic? I mean, we've got issues collectively just to survive. We're living in an age of extinction. And whatever else is going on, you know, we don't have to be killing each other, I don't think.
Right. And but the skeptics would respond to you that all the things you mentioned about slavery and feminism and equality and egalitarianism, though by analogy, that doesn't really captivate or drill down into the problem of war. Every analogy is always weak. It's a weak form of inductive reasoning, as we both know. What is the basis? What's the moral basis of saying that we should stop war? Since and this is what I've heard skeptics put this out there, that the problem with those who want to eliminate war is that they don't have any universal absolute that they ground their predicate on, that they ground their proposition on. So let me ask you: is it? Are you arguing this just as a means of pragmatism, utilitarianism? Is it just the greatest good for the greatest number? Why should we stop war?
You're so lofty. It's really it's a collective prudence.
Okay.
I mean, it's in our interest at this point. We have weapons now that, you know, within one exchange, we're all gone. Now, what is the point of that? You know, we grew up under mutually assured destruction, the MAD doctrine, and is that beneficial? You know, when you think about presently, I think it's been proposed that we need to upgrade. I think this may have started with the Obama administration, but the upgrading of our nuclear arsenal, and there may be like a decade's commitment and $1 trillion. What are we going to do with those weapons? Who are they going to be dropped on? And we know now that enough about the weather, the way the jet stream works, that if Iran nuked Israel, it's all coming back on you. It's blowing back on you. So it's not clear what the value of these weapons are. But there's a conservative tendency in the human spirit that, well, this is the way we've done it in the past. This is the way it's been. The past is sacred.
Yeah.
And they hold on to that in a way. But, you know, I'm willing – two things about the skeptic. I recognize this is an experiment. If you're looking for certainty and necessity and predictability, it's not in this. It's a vision. It's a positive hope for humanity. And the other thing that we've discovered is we don't have to convince everybody. Social processes aren't changed by a majority. They're changed by dedicated minorities.
Yeah, looping back to the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, which, by the way, you told me one day it's still in effect. It has not been repealed.
By anybody.
No, by anybody. And the United States is a signatory. France is a signatory, right?
Yeah.
Because Mr. Briand was French.
Yes.
And Mr. Kellogg was American.
So are the Germans. Yeah, there's 63 nations.
Right. And then, but immediately after that, we have World War II.
Well, not immediately.
Well,
first, we had the invasion of Manchuria by Japan.
Right, we had that.
And then we had the rise of Nazism.
Exactly. And that's what I want to get into in the next segment. I want to get into this nationalism issue. I want to drill down into why people are still grasping on war as a way to settle conflict. I'm Mark McIntyre. I'm your host here today for Voices of Santa Barbara. My guest is Professor Emeritus Joseph White, Santa Barbara City College. We'll be right back. Stay with us. The reason why Professor Joseph White, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Santa Barbara City College, 30 years. Well, he wasn't emeritus for 30 years. He actually had to earn it. And he's just received an award from the United Nations Association here on the Central Coast for his work on a project called A Year Without War. And if you listen to the first two segments, you can understand why he was given the award. Because he certainly is now putting to good use the 30 years of being in the classroom and arguing his case. He's very capable of doing that. And so what we've been talking about is not only the plan, which is, to reiterate, get one member state to put a resolution.
Begin the process.
Begin the process. Well, you take it from there. Repeat the process again.
Looking for one UN member state to begin the process of seeking a 10-month extension to the 2024 Paris Olympic truce.
Right.
2-month Paris Olympic truce.
Right. And to do that, we would need that one nation. And so instead of taking the long road, which is what you started with doing.
Which is where we were building out the community to lobby the United Nations.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You thought that would be the way to do it. But
well, it in 2011, during the middle of the Arab Spring, what really impressed me was Tunisia. And that incident of the young man who I believe self-immolated himself.
Right.
And Tunisia was under a dictatorship, and the millennials just took to social media and started a revolution. And it resulted in a change of government in Tunisia. And from what I understand, it's gone well for Tunisia through this time. It's a democracy now. Yeah. I believe it's called the Group of Five in Tunisia that got the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago for their work. It didn't go so well in Libya.
No.
It hasn't gone well in Syria.
Not too well in Syria, no.
It's been so bumpy in Egypt.
Yeah.
And Yemen is a mess, But you see the aspirations of the youth. And from what I followed recently going on in Iran, the young people in Iran have about had it with the Ayatollah at this point. So there's all this change in the world. And when I saw that back in 2011, I thought, this is one of the problems I have in class right now, just getting kids off of their phones.
Right.
Well, why not feed them?
Right.
I'll try out this Year Without War idea. They loved it. Students love it. Low-hanging fruit.
Sure.
And I thought, well, now if we can – there are at least 500 million of them around the world. They've all got these cell phones. If we could build a community of 500 million, we'll probably be up there bigger than Oprah, and we'll be able to get something going here on Earth. Maybe we can tip history and just get a year without war.
But it didn't work out that way.
Well, it doesn't work out that way because it's so bloody complicated and expensive.
Yeah.
When I went to find out about building the first website, I was told, well, that'll be $25,000. And so
that's
that point
cheap. That's cheap.
Yeah. And I went back into the classroom and had a couple of computer science students, and one fellow in particular who we just built for hours and hours and hours with the generous mentoring of Oniracom here in Santa Barbara.
That's right.
Jacob Tell is wonderful, and his crew over there.
Right.
And we nickeled and dimed and put together our first website and started the process. And then over the next 8 years, ended up building 3 different websites, all with wonderful student volunteers coming in, new platforms and all that, and continuing to build. But it was quickly realized that, you get over 20,000 people regularly coming to your website. It needs daily maintenance. You know,
full-time
you gotta
job.
you got to
Full-time
have
job.
people handling your social media. As you know, all the different projects we had on our website, and we started getting photos from around the world, people holding up a year without war signs, and it gets to be full-time. And you can't volunteer full-time. That won't pay your rent or your mortgage.
Right.
So suddenly I was confronted with having to raise $250,000 just to keep this going at this point. Now I was still teaching full-time with my 500 sweethearts.
I don't know how you
every
did
semester.
that. I don't know how you did that, Joe.
Yeah, well, I look back. I don't either.
I don't know how you did that.
Psychoses.
Gosh.
But so it just what we realized was that in order to do this from the grassroots, you really had to have the financing in place, and we just didn't have it.
Yeah, and the reason that didn't happen is because people are so distracted with their temporary gazing into the black mirror of their cell phone, and not liking the reflections that they see in this black mirror, and to get distracted. So they you can get their attention, like, oh, that's a great idea, but very quickly somebody else has got their attention, and somebody else, and somebody else, and somebody else.
And out of fairness too, as we were building the community, the question that started to come up is, okay, now what are we going to do? Where do we go now? And really at the outset, it was thinking like, well, let's just build a community.
Right.
Well, you got to have some place to go.
Right.
And my weakness was that I shared in what I think is a pervasive American cynicism toward the United Nations. It's like, we give them all this money. What do? They talk all the time. They don't get anything done. You know, what the heck's the United Nations all about anyway? Right. And it was really once I left the United States, and I've been on 4 continents with this program, and you start to see what the United Nations actually does in the world, and you start to see that there's a whole community out there that is pervasive in the world, wanting peace. All these different peace groups and big groups like Rotary, Lions, these groups, but nobody's focused. Yeah. Nobody has, what's the old KISS thing? Keep it simple, stupid. And so what we realized after we discovered that there's already an Olympic truce that gets passed by the United Nations, and then we discovered they also do a 1 month for the Paralympics. We thought, well, basically, let's just tag 10 months onto it.
Right.
And then once we got that would probably give us the gravitas, knowing how the United Nations is respected in so many other countries around the world. That would give us a kind of gravitas where we could then start building that community. And then these other major organizations that have the finances would probably, we think, would be disposed to supporting us.
Yeah. Have you thought about the fact that your situation really is improving? Your case is being well made, better because of the what I like to call the decentralization of nationalism. Nationalism, it seems, I think any school child can tell you that the reason nations go to war is because the French believe that they're better than the English, and the English think they're better than the Americans, and the Swedes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the reason why. But the younger people, especially with open borders, that sort of thing, there seems to be less of a conviction about being a member of a particular nation among the younger people, which should make your message and your program more attractive to those people, it would seem to me.
And that's what I found in initially dealing with the millennials. I thought, here is a group that and granted, we're in Santa Barbara, but we do get students from all over the world, and we have quite a few, at that time, foreign students coming to visit, study abroad, but foreign students. And I was part of the study abroad program up there for 4 or 5 different programs. And so we had all these American students that wanted to leave and go experience other cultures. But being up there, what I realized was that if I start off a class and I said, okay, let's say you get $20,000, what would you do at this point? Travel. That was overwhelmingly travel. Where would you go? And if you gave them an opportunity to talk, someone just wanted to go to Asia, someone to go to Europe, someone to go to South America. Why do you want to go there? The music, the food. You know, there's a natural disposition toward being, I think, what we'd refer to as being cosmopolitan. Right. You know, they're not as nationalistic. They're not as ethnocentric. They're curious. They want to get out in the world. And this is a pretty exciting time, I think, for all of us.
It's the best education you can get is to travel.
Yeah. And to travel and to respect where you are, because I've known people who travel and they come back even more arrogant and snobbish than when they left, and it's just like those people, you wouldn't believe how they wear their hair. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, but we're going to come up on our our third break right now, but I want to preface that by saying that, nationalism seems to be on the decline on the one hand, but yet it seems to have a resurgence on the other. It's kind of schizophrenic what's happening to nationalism. And this is one of the causes for divisions that are happening. Mm-hmm. The decentralization of large structures. The Vatican, for instance, is going into schism. The European Union is on the verge of breaking up.
Let's talk about moral psychology.
Exactly. We're going to talk about moral psychology because we are here on Voices of Santa Barbara, and we are talking to Professor Emeritus, Professor Joseph White of Santa Barbara City College, now retired, and full-time now working on A Year Without War. I'm Mark McIntyre. We'll be right back after these messages. Having a great conversation with my friend of 25 years, Professor Joseph White, Professor Emeritus. I keep forgetting to say that. And Professor White is here today having a conversation with us about his project, A Year Without War. He's been working for 9 years, nurturing and pushing the Sisyphus' rock up that hill, only to see it fall down again, and he goes back down.
I'd be smiling as I walk back down.
Yes. Happy in his misery,
in his descent,
his descent
to find his burden.
Exactly.
Yet again.
Yeah. I love that essay of Sisyphus. Anyway, so he is here today to talk about the next move, about where we're going to be going with A Year Without War. Because it does seem to be getting traction for a number of things. First of all, as he told us in the first three segments before this one, the world has changed, and he has changed, and his attitudes and his methodology have changed, and nationalism has changed, and the whole notion of moral authority has changed, and moral psychology has changed. So I thought we'd spend this segment, Joe, to talk about what has been the movement, in your view, that is helpful to your project in terms of moral psychology?
Well, the moral psychological aspect of it, I would describe as what we find our natural dispositions to be. Mm-hmm. And for the human being, especially the adult human being, not so much the child, which isn't denigrating the child, it's just developmental psychology, I think. Right. With maturation comes reflection. Mm-hmm. And what you might find to be a natural disposition, in maturity, you find perhaps it's something that you should not do. Mm-hmm. You may be naturally disposed to be a kleptomaniac, but, you shouldn't be doing that.
Or a liar.
Right. Compulsive liar.
But you're good at it. You're really good at it.
And you've survived at it. That's how you've gotten
through
life.
And you profit.
Yeah.
You profit through it.
And you may have a natural disposition towards, say, something like narcissism.
Right.
But for a reflective human being, you say things like, maybe I shouldn't be a peeping Tom. Right. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Even though you're naturally disposed to do that, you check yourself, and you check yourself with your values. I think there's something fascinating that's happening with the next generation of human beings insofar as they tend to be much more tolerant. I grew up in a Catholic, in a pious Catholic family. That and I was expected to be a priest. That was that was
another thing we have in common.
that was their expectation. And I went into a high school seminary.
You would have met a good priest.
But I think I'm a compassionate guy. Yeah. I listen. I don't know if I could have abided by it.
See you as a cardinal, actually, starting it. They should have started you off as a cardinal.
I would have done all right.
Exactly. You would have done it right.
But there was anti-Semitism in my family. And there was racism in my family. And my father in particular was naturally conservative in a way that I wasn't, having grown up during the 50s and 60s. And so this generation that we have now, I think, is even more tolerant, and they have the wherewithal to travel the world. I was quite enchanted with traveling around the United States at that time because my family basically never left the Midwest.
Yeah.
But I felt comfortable taking off in the summer with college friends and going to Arizona or the Rockies or just traveling around. And I think the millennials now, so many of them I've dealt with in college, are just they'll go any place in the world. They want to learn other languages. And they really have a deeper respect for diversity than I think previous generations. And I think that may speak to your notion of nationalism, where we still have a kind of almost rabid patriotism. And it's not just a pride of being patriotic. It comes almost with an anger and an arrogance. And I don't see it so much in a lot of these young people.
I agree that especially the Generation Z, I think they're calling themselves Generation Z, 18 to 23 now. They keep changing, rebranding. Anyway, I've noticed something in the last year that I was teaching and dealing with Generation Z people. You're right. They're much more tolerant in one sense about humanity and the need to get along and to better the species. On the other side, though, there's a greater tendency to be much more conservative, that they are really interested in finding universal, absolute moral anchors to their lives and their decisions. And their reasoning, as some of them have explained it to me, now these are Catholics, Jews, atheists. It doesn't really matter how they deploy on religion. But they tell me that it started as a question: why is truth true? And it takes a very sophisticated mind to even ask the question: why is the truth true? And what they mean by this question is the fact that unless there's some universal absolute truth, let's say in the case of war is bad, let's just use that as your example. War is bad. It's universally bad. It's absolutely bad. They seem to be looking for something of that nature, which transcends nationalism.
And I think that's youthfulness. I think with age, what you realize, as we mentioned in a previous segment, there's just tremendous contingency in the world, you know. And I wouldn't even say that, you know, war is absolutely wrong. I mean, I've seen enough fictional accounts of alien confrontations where the human species has to save itself from the cannibalistic insect androids.
I know, it wears me out when I watch these films.
Well, but you know, it's. I think you're right. I think in these young people sense the uncertainty and being youthful. They want. And it's not just youth, I shouldn't say. I think, you know, there have been a number of studies that have come out in the context of moral psychology, and one, Jonathan Haidt in particular, his group has these 5 markers that they talk about. And you find 2 of them in most every human being, but 3 of them aren't present in all human beings. And this is just the psychology. This is what you're naturally disposed to do.
Right.
But when you get more sophisticated, you think, should I do that? Whereas a child will naturally have these kinds of dispositions. And the first one is pain or harm avoidance. Most all Homo sapiens is probably the starting of utilitarianism.
Jeremy Bentham.
Yeah, you know, where you want to avoid pain.
Pain, yeah. And seek pleasure.
Yeah, and we share this amongst us cross-culturally.
That seems to be a universal cultural marker.
And and we share it with animals. Yep. And with higher primates, we share a second one about reciprocity. We get very upset if it's not equal. But by the third marker, there's some of us who are naturally disposed to seeing us versus them. And so what you start to see is that, well, you're not really part of us. You're different from us. And the fourth thing is, what really marks us off is we have a way of doing things. And the way of doing things is hierarchical and authoritative. And in our most conservative side, it's sacred. It's God-given. So what we have, for example, when you look at the problem, the conflict we have now at the southern border, you see liberals who say, oh, my gosh, these are children you're putting in these cages. I mean, these people, I can't tell the difference looking at somebody between a refugee and an immigrant. We've got to, these people are suffering. They're escaping. Then you got concerns, say, but they're breaking the law. This is illegal. This is that psychological disposition, which needs to be raised to a normative level. You can't, people just have this, the law is the law. You can't break the law. What's going to happen? There's going to be chaos. Well, the law. Well, we know people break the law all the time. I was late getting here. I had to cross against red lights.
Yeah, I was going to arrest you.
Who knows,
Actually, you probably photographed breaking.
Well, my first month in Santa Barbara, I got pulled over for not coming to a complete stop on my bicycle at 10:30 at night. I had to go to court over there.
Yeah, so there are these people.
Law, so those are those natural dispositions that we have, and we have to recognize that these are dispositions. Sometimes they lead us well, sometimes they don't lead us so well. We may get too sentimental and not do our duty, and other times we might do our duty, and then suddenly the heavens fall.
Yeah.
So it's not easy being a reflective adult. And I think what it tied into A Year Without War, that gives everybody an opportunity to think about these things.
Yeah.
Let's just call it quits for 1 year. And I'm willing, if the 1 year is really bad and we need to get back to war, we could nuke each other.
Yeah, you land on something very important, and that is that while universal seems to be emerging, the more we know about human psychology, especially in the moral sphere, the universals seem to be sought after, at least, and there seem to be commonalities among universals. But that doesn't necessarily translate to absolutes. And the distinction between a universal and an absolute is where you're working. You want a universal shutdown of war. But you're not saying absolutely that you could not have a defensive war if you were invaded, that you would not be morally justified, for instance, because you're not a peace organization.
Yeah, let's cross that bridge when we get there.
But you're not a peace organization.
No, we're not pacifist, and we're not anti-military.
Right.
Our military is so effective now, we could solve a whole lot of ecological problems.
Well, the only problem we have right now is we're running out of time for this segment, so we're going to take our last break and then come back with Professor Emeritus Joseph White, Santa Barbara City College, where he's going to explain to us the legacy of his program, A Year Without War. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back with Professor Emeritus Joseph White, a friend of mine for 25 years. The only mistake he ever made was hiring me at Santa Barbara City College Philosophy Department. But we've had fun over the years. Joe has been on the show here. This is his fourth appearance, and so he knows the drill that our last segment is always about legacy. One of the great things about Joe that I appreciate is the fact that he does have a transcendent set of values, not in a religious context, but in a human context. And a lot of his supporters are from the Humanist Society here in Santa Barbara that have been very interested and supportive of his work. But there's a growing sensation, it seems, that nationalism is not really the way we're going to solve our problems, and certainly not the way we're going to resolve our conflicts. So, Joe, how do you see your working at this project to have a long impact of a legacy for your work? How do you see that?
In the long term.
The long term, yeah.
Let's stretch it out. Let's say Joe's 95 years old.
Oh, gosh. I don't want to be 95 years old, Joe.
Well,
you don't want to be either.
Well, I'm kind of looking at this as probably another good 10 years of dedicated work to get this where it needs to be.
Right.
And, we've always gone by the initials of AYWW. It's always been A Year Without War.
Right.
Well, let's suppose we get our truce. And let's suppose that we build a community of a few 100 million people, and we create our own little Y2K moment on that December 31st, 2023, and there are literally hundreds of millions of people saying, is this going to hold? Will this happen? And at that point, for that to happen, this organization will probably have offices on all continents working at this, because it's pretty intensive to see that, to try to enforce this, to build it, to lobby, to figure it out. And if it works and it becomes not just a year without war, but another year without war, and maybe another year without war, and I sit back and I'm not part of it, and I just watch it unfold, I will have a tear of joy in my old age. I will truly sit, and that's all I want. I as a child, I was just hurt watching concentration film footage from, and it just bothers me personally. I don't know why I'm so bothered by it.
I've always, when people have asked me why was I involved with you on the Year Without War, and they would say to me, well, do you really think it's going to happen? I said, that's not the point.
Yeah.
The point is to work towards it.
Yes.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Is it better to work towards ending war than to not work about it? Of course it is.
Yeah.
There's my meaning of a universal.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for being on the show for the fourth consecutive time. You now hold the record for professors at City College. Thank you, Joe. And
thank you for the cup of tea.
yes, and best of wishes to you and your family during the holidays. Merry Christmas.
And to all your listeners.
Okay. Bye-bye.